Hello and welcome to a new video in this series, The Real Reflected, where I try to have a short philosophical look at events or phenomena that exist today in our society. Today I would like to talk about not a particular event, but something that can be considered an important issue in today's world, which is citizenship. Now, there's something strange about this notion today, because when you look at the reality that we have today, social political reality, on the one hand we can see very clearly this insistence on the importance of the nation. I'll have to come back to that, but we can clearly see in the resurgence of nationalism today there is this insistence. But on the other hand, there seems to be an absence or virtual absence of the notion of citizenship within that context, within that political and social context. So the question is, why is that? So let's start with looking at the way citizenship is used today. What is the meaning of citizenship today as is used in politics, in social discourse? Well, clearly the notion of citizenship finds its origin in the modern notion of the nation state, right? So what is a citizen in the modern nation state? It's those people that belong to a national community. In other words, a people, right? Defined as a nation. And when people have this status of a citizen in that sense, well, it affords them certain rights, which we call civil rights, and entitles people to enjoy certain rights, we could say. Now, this belonging to that community, defined by the nation, is also fundamentally territorial. In what way? Well, first, it's territorial simply by the fact that it relies on national boundaries, right? Indeed, borders. Which indeed then function as a both geographical and political dividing line. So there's a very clear limit and boundary of inclusion and exclusion. And second, it's territorial in the sense that the nation functions as a principle of inclusion-exclusion. So not only by geographical boundaries, but simply by making a very clear distinction between the citizen, who is included, and the non-citizen who is then excluded from that community. So it's a strictly defined political space. In that sense, we can say it's not just territorial, but indeed territorialized, to use a notion that was quite important in the work of the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who I will come back to. So that's the way it's used today in real political discourse. But there's also a more philosophical and more perhaps fundamental meaning to the word citizenship. And that notion, that aspect of citizenship is much older and very prominent in history of philosophy. It's that of citizenship as the belonging to a political community. Now, citizenship, you have the word city, which is based on the Latin translation of the Greek polis, right? Latin translation is civitas. Polis is the Greek word for the city or the city-state, which refers to the model of the Athenian democracy, right, which is a political community. So that's what the word really comes from. So citizenship in that political sense is the right to participate in the political community. So not a nation or national community, not a people, but a political community. And this has a number of consequences when we compare political citizenship to the sort of nationalist definition that seems to have become dominant today. First of all, when citizenship is defined politically, we define a citizen as an active position because it's the right to participate, which means what? It means it's the right to engage in political action. So it's an active position. And second, and this is also crucial, I think, political citizenship is defined fundamentally in opposition to the state, which is very much contrary to the idea of citizenship in terms of the nation state and the sort of underlying unity that always wants to absorb all differences. In the political sense, citizenship does not abide by, let's say, the real or the reality that's prescribed by the state. Indeed, it goes against that. Why? Because it always wants to create new realities from possibilities, which is in a way the definition of politics itself. So the citizen in this sense is what you can call the constituent power, right? Citizens have the power and are the power in a way to define the political reality. And therefore they have to be fundamentally opposed to the reality prescribed by the state. So that would be the political notion of citizenship. So this seems to have disappeared today. So why is that? I think the answer, of course, to that question is very complex, but any answer to that question must start from the idea that our current democracies are no longer primarily political communities. That is essential to any answer to this question. So what are these communities then based on if they're not political? Well, they're based on, you could call it culture. Culture then understood, defined as a form of consumption, which creates a streamlined community of consumers. We would need to go into very great detail to really understand what that means, but I think it works quite well here just to contrast culture to politics, or a cultural community to a political community. So does that mean that if political citizenship doesn't really seem to play a role anymore today, that this fundamental political sense of citizenship is obsolete now? Well, it's an important question. I think when you use a notion, be it a philosophical notion, it needs to allow us to face reality, face the real, and at the very least to make it more intelligible. So the question is, can political citizenship do that? Well, we need to look at what our reality is. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our reality is the resurgence of different degrees and different forms of nationalism, which are many times extremely violent, if not overtly belligerent. And they all are what I would call hyper-territorial in the current context, particularly. What does that mean? Well, just look at what's going on. The so-called Pacific democracies that we know today are quickly transforming themselves into basically war machines, and it's not just one or two countries. War has become a part of the constitution of our political reality today, even in a democracy. So nationalism in this form is certainly a way of trying desperately, if you like, to deny something that has always been an important part of human history, which is the importance of movement, of migration. Human history is a history of migration. Trying to deny this by resorting to this form of nationalism is never going to produce anything but violence, right? So if we try to use citizenship as a notion here, it would need to help us make sense of this and help us deal with this reality and not try to deny it. So that means that for citizenship to have a meaning today, it would have to not only be opposed to the state and its sort of totalitarian quest for unity, as I mentioned before, but it has to also build, and I think this is the key element here, it has to build upon and work with and not against differences. Now, which differences am I talking about? Well, first of all, I'm talking about fundamentally, and this is a very philosophical way of putting it, the alterity of the other. What does that mean? Well, the alterity, the otherness of the other. It means recognizing, accepting, working with plurality in a very political sense. For example, to give a simple example, working with different populations, accepting them, working with the conflicts, working with the differences between these populations, and trying to construct a political reality based on that. This fundamentally cannot be a simple implementation of state logic, because state logic, again, is always unifying and trying to absorb differences. So citizenship in a political sense today, and this is almost a paradox, because traditionally citizenship has been associated with the state or the nation state. So political citizenship today would have to be something opposed to state logic. It would have to be a minority notion. Now, what do I mean with minority? It's basically a concept that is quite prominent in the work of the French philosopher I mentioned before, Gilles Deleuze, who talks about minor or minoritarian. What does that mean? Minoritarian is not a question of being in the minority in terms of numbers. Rather, it's a position in which you are opposed to dominant forces that indeed want to reduce difference to identity. So there is the idea of minority in the sense of opposition to power. So I think citizenship, if it still has a meaning today, if it still wants to be meaningful for us today, it would have to be this kind of minoritarian citizenship. I think that's the only way we can make sense of it. All right, so that's the philosophical conclusion we've come to today. Obviously, this is just the basis for a more in-depth analysis and reflection. And that's, of course, the point of these videos. So that's all for today. So thank you for watching, and we'll talk about something else next time.